When I was small, we went to a Citroën dealership to look at the CX, and I was struck by just how odd looking this French creation really was. With the rear wheels half covered, my child's brain wondered just how changing a flat tyre worked, and the car sat low like the suspension was broken or something. I pored over the brochure at home, and strange things like the linear speedometer dazzled my young mind, amazed by this crazy space-age creation from a far-off land. The CX was the last car produced by an independent Citroën. With the company going into meltdown during development, it was starved of resources, but it's another Citroën design classic that's worth celebrating today. This is a Citroën CX story. Citroën's DS had taken the world by storm with its innovative magic carpet-like hydropneumatic suspension and headlights that turned with the steering. After its 1955 release, sales had continued to grow throughout the 1960s, but even as sales of the DS continued to climb, it became clear that Citroën needed a successor. Work began on Projet L in the last few months of the 1960s under the leadership of Robert Opron, who would design the Citroën SM and GS that would soon be released in 1970. It was decided early on that the car would use a Wankel rotary engine that Citroën was developing in conjunction with NSU. It promised to be a lighter and more compact engine, and thus Citroën gave Projet L a small engine bay. This would make it a more compact car, 16 centimeters shorter than the DS, that still had excellent interior space. Projet L would also use the same cut-off teardrop shape that had produced such a low drag factor for the SM and GS before it, and it was styled by Pininfarina. The Citroën SM had shown that cars with a low drag factor got better fuel economy, and with rotary engines being such thirsty beasts, a low drag factor would really help. Although not a direct copy, Pininfarina undoubtedly lent on the Austin 1800 restyling job they were contracted to do for the British Motor Company in 1967, just before they were purchased by British Leyland. Once the styling was completed, the new car would have a class-leading drag factor of just 0.36, and with such a big focus on aerodynamics compared to its predecessor, the DS, Citroën decided to name the car the CX after the letters used for drag factor in France. Although the CX looked like a hatchback, like the XM that would follow it, it was a saloon. But just like the DS before it, an estate would also be produced. A low roof design was considered, but with Citroën wanting to break into the North American market, it was felt the low roof wouldn't appeal to drivers there. However, despite the roof being raised, European reviewers would still criticise the car for a lack of headroom. The DS mounted its engine longitudinally, which meant the engine bay had to be long to cater for the largest engine in the range. The CX would use a rotary engine, but it would also use four-cylinder engines in entry-level models, and there was even a plan to use the V6 Maserati engine used in the SM. By mounting the engine transversely, the engine bay could be much shorter, but it also meant a new gearbox would have to be designed to fit into this new space. Engine noise would be kept to a minimum, using rubber mounts to insulate the engine from its base frame, which was itself rubber insulated from the body. This gave a level of refinement not seen on the previous car. The car would use an improved version of their successful hydropneumatic suspension, and that hydraulic system would also power the braking system that used improved ventilated disc brakes. Citroën would use a conventional brake pedal rather than the quirky mushroom button on the DS and SM. It would use the innovative Duravi self-centering power-assisted steering system from the much more expensive SM. But this would be an option, and without it, critics would complain that the steering was far too heavy. As development continued, it became clear that the CX was critical to Citroën's finances. The SM had been a sales disaster, and the 15-year-old DS wasn't going to be a top seller forever. The car needed to be released soon, and it needed to sell well. The Maserati V6 was dropped due to lack of time and resources, and the Duravi steering system would appear a few months after the car was released. In 1973, disaster struck. After 10 years of development, Citroën proudly launched their 106 horsepower rotary engine on the GS Birotor. It made the car expensive, 70% more than the standard GS. Fuel economy was worse than regular engines, and the timing couldn't have been worse. It was launched in October 1973, the first month of the oil crisis that would see petrol prices soar. And to add insult to injury, the engine was unreliable. After selling just 847 cars, Citroën quickly axed the engine. This had an even worse effect on the upcoming CX. With its small engine bay, the car had been built around the rotary engine. Citroën was about to learn the hard way that if you build a car around one key piece of technology, if that fails, you're in deep, deep trouble. Ford would learn the same lesson when launching the facelifted Ford Edge in 2010, where certain car functions would only be effectively controlled through the disastrous MyFord Touch in-car entertainment system. Citroën had to lean on the smallest of the DS four-cylinder engines, leaving the car underpowered, and the car would launch with less power than the outgoing DS model. Even if the Maserati V6 could be used, the SM had shown it was unreliable, and Citroën was about to sell Maserati in 1975, removing this option for good. North American sales were dealt a blow when in 1974 the USA banned any car with height adjustable suspension. Citroën had designed the whole car around this feature, so selling it in the States was a non-starter. Even Mercedes had to alter their 450 SEL that used similar suspension to get around the ban. The rule was repealed in 1981, but by then it was all too late. In the summer of 1974, with Citroën spending heavily on tooling for the CX launch, the financial dam finally burst and Citroën was forced to ask the French government for a bailout. The result was a partnership with rival Peugeot to form PSA. That partnership quickly progressed into a full-on takeover by early 1976, with commitments from Peugeot that Citroën would remain a separate product line with their own identity. The CX was launched just a couple of months after the Peugeot partnership. It had been rushed to market, and it showed. The car's underpowered 2-litre and 2.2-litre engines produced just 102 and 112 horsepower. Those 10-year-old engines weren't very economical either, and not even the lowest drag factor could make up for that. With heavy engines and the front wheel stored under the bonnet, over 2/3 of the weight of the car was up front, making for an imbalanced car that understeered into corners. At launch, only the smaller 2-litre engine was available, and without power steering, early reviewers spoke of a slow car with heavy steering. It's never a good idea to start customers' experience of a new car with the base model, because first impressions count. It clearly had its shortcomings, but there was also a lot to love about the new CX. The space-age design, the Duravi power-assisted steering eventually when it arrived, the science fiction dashboard, something of a trademark for Citroën. Despite their reservations, the press gave it good reviews and it became European Car of the Year in 1975. A diesel version of the petrol engine, used in the Citroën C35, arrived that same year, delivering over 35 miles per gallon. But it was even more underpowered than the petrol engines, with a paltry 0 to 60 time of 19 seconds. The promised CX station wagon arrived in 1976. It had an extended wheelbase that was also used for the new CX Prestige Saloon, giving a luxurious level of rear legroom. And Citroën would also experiment with a version with 3 rows of seats that could seat up to 8 people. A 3-speed automatic gearbox was also available, and with it a larger 2.4-litre engine arrived, giving it an improved but not amazing 0 to 60 time of 11.4 seconds. It was actually just the old DS engine that Citroën had finally managed to shoehorn under the CX's bonnet. The 2.4-litre was further uprated in 1977 with fuel injection, taking the 0 to 60 time down to a more respectable 10.4 seconds. Citroën took the CX rallying, and it had some notable victories, initially in the Senegal Rally in 1977 that they won 3 times, and also the Paris-Dakar Rally in 1981. They also took part in the gruelling 17,500 mile London to Sydney Rally in 1977, placing 3rd. Sales of the CX were respectable, but not spectacular. Citroën didn't have the worldwide reach other car manufacturers did, and North America was no longer an option, and this limited sales. But possibly the main barrier was some of the car's quirky features. The indicators weren't on a stalk like most other cars, but were controlled using a rocker switch, and they had to be manually cancelled by the driver. The linear speedometer was a little unusual. The heater controls were mounted next to the handbrake, where crumbs and ash could fall into the cracks, and the car used only one wiper blade, which didn't reach all parts of the screen, and reviewers complained gave less overall visibility. Again, first impressions count, and having to get used to a different way of driving on the all-important initial test drive could impact sales. And car rental sales were going to be hard for the same reasons. But to be fair to Citroën, the car's design was a lot more conventional than previous cars, showing the company was listening to feedback. The standout feature introduced on the CX in 1978 has to be the ashtray shaped like an air freshener perched on top of the dashboard, like some treasured ornament on the mantelpiece. Is it just me, or does it look like some sort of Glade air freshener from the 1970s? Those outdated engines were updated in 1979 with the all-new aluminium Duvrin engine. It was a joint development between PSA and Renault and provided not just faster acceleration but better fuel economy and a more evenly balanced car. And a 5-speed manual gearbox was made available for the first time. The CX, like the DX before it, was customised into many different vehicles. The BBC used both the DS and the CX to cover horse racing, and its suspension provided stable pictures over the bumpy grass terrain. And it was also popular as a small ambulance. PSA had two large cars, the Peugeot 605 and the Citroën CX, and it was joined by a third, the Talbot Tagora, with PSA's purchase of Chrysler's European operations in 1979. But PSA's limited development and marketing budget wasn't being put into these low-volume cars. They were focusing on creating the new 205 Super Mini that would revive its fortunes in the 1980s. PSA would slowly retreat from the large car sector as German brands took over, with the continual relaxation of EEC trade restrictions between countries. The highest sales figures for the Citroën DS were in 1970, 15 years after it was launched, but by 1980 the competition was passing the CX by, and sales were already starting to drop. CX designer Robert Offpron had left the company and was working at rival Renault, working on cars like the Renault Fuego. Citroën design lead Jean Girey, fresh off his work on the BX, felt the 6-year-old CX needed a styling update, so started Project E or Project E to update the CX. The update would be both a saloon and a hatchback. But all this work was being done behind management's back. PSA had decreed that the CX would be the last oddball Citroën. When they got wind of the project, they were incensed. In their mind, the CX was old technology and there was no point investing any more money into it. The project was cancelled and PSA imposed their own design team within Citroën. By 1981, customers' love of the CX was dwindling. It rusted quickly, and Citroën did try and address this in the early 1980s with better rust-proofing. A small styling update appeared in 1982, but no major changes were coming from a car that had been left out to dry. With a reputation as a slow car with high running costs, sales started to falter. Even that class-leading drag factor of 0.36 was soon eclipsed by the Audi 100's 0.3 in 1982. But some small changes were made. 1983 bought the CX TRD, a 2.5 litre injected version of the existing diesel engine, giving 95 horsepower. The petrol GTI was boosted to 136 horsepower, dropping the 0 to 60 mph time down a full second to 8.7 seconds. And that time would be further improved with the ultimate CX in 1984, the GTI Turbo. The 136 horsepower engine got the car to 60 mph in just 7.6 seconds, and newly introduced ABS brakes took it quickly back down to 0. The CX didn't have the prestigious 6-cylinder engines of the competition, but it wasn't the slow tortoise it had been at launch. A much-needed styling update came 11 years after the CX's launch with the Series 2. The dashboard had a major update with standard speedometer and rev counter. The heater controls moved to the dashboard and the stereo moved next to the handbrake, so it too could get a dose of crumbs and ash rather than the heater controls. It was a little more conventional, with parent PSA working to smooth off the quirky edges that buyers seemed unwilling to put up with. On the outside, the car got plastic bumpers and a firmer suspension. ABS was still an option, but this was when Ford released their new Granada with ABS as standard. PSA were trying to get a few extra years from the car before the XM replaced it at the end of the decade, and they wanted to spend as little as possible so that they could pour their limited resources into cars that would deliver a bigger profit. Over its life, the CX was owned by many heads of state, like French President Jacques Chirac, the Portuguese Prime Minister, Danish and Dutch princes, a Norwegian king, and Prince Rainier of Monaco and his wife Grace Kelly. But it was also driven by more dodgy world leaders like East German head Erich Honecker and South American dictators Manuel Noriega and Augusto Pinochet. It seemed everybody wanted to get their hands on a CX. With the CX's successor, the XM, in development since 1984, Citroën did precious little to improve it in the last years of its life. There were some small fuel economy improvements, and the turbo diesel was further boosted to give it a top speed over 120 miles an hour and a 0 to 60 time just under 10 seconds, like its sister the Citroën BX. Production of the saloon ended in 1989 with the introduction of the XM, but the estate soldiered on in limited production for another couple of years until the XM Estate appeared. The CX was hampered by a lack of finances during development and being built around an engine that ultimately couldn't be used, meaning for much of its life it was compromised on power and handling. Once Citroën was bought by PSA, the owner lost interest, and it was seemingly just a numbers game for them to try and maximise profits from the sunk cost Citroën had made in the 1970s. It's a shame, because the DS deserved a much more worthy successor, and if more money had been available and the rotary engine had been a hit, the CX could have been that car. A big thank you to all my patrons for supporting me. To get early advert-free access to new videos or to appear in the credits, please consider supporting me using the Patreon link below from just $1 or 80p a month, and hit that subscribe button to get notified of new videos. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.